This is the sound of the most improbable diesel engine Britain ever committed to metal. It is not what a diesel is supposed to sound like. It stumbles, it barks, it seems to argue with itself before it settles. And yet that noise dragged some of the most heavily worked trucks in the world through 2 decades of hard labor. Along the wet trunk roads of England, across the baked emptiness of the Australian interior, and underneath the sleek aluminium skin of a transporter that ferried Le Mans winning cars to the starting line, 2 pistons in every cylinder, 6 pistons across 3 bores, not a single valve, no camshaft to time anything, and nothing else on the planet its size that could do what it did. A single fleet of 8 lorries put 1.25 million miles on the design, on roads that ought to have torn it apart. It made the power of engines twice its capacity. And then, in 1972, it was simply gone. Scrapped, discontinued, erased. So why did Britain take the one machine nobody else on Earth had managed to build and throw it away? This is the story of the Commer TS3. And it begins with one engineer who looked at every rule of diesel design that everyone agreed on and decided to break all of them at the same time. To understand the engine, you first have to stand in the city that made it. Coventry, in the summer of 1945. Wind the clock back 5 years to the night of the 14th of November, 1940. More than 500 German aircraft came across the coast in wave after wave and held the city beneath a ceiling of fire for 11 unbroken hours. The devastation was so absolute that German radio reached for a new word to describe it. To coventrate, to wreck a place so completely that nothing left standing in it still works. By first light, the cathedral was a hollow shell open to the sky. The old medieval streets at the center were nothing but warm ash, and the works that were the whole reason the bombers had crossed the channel in the first place, the machine shops and the foundries and the assembly halls of the industrial Midlands, absorbed the very worst of it. This is the city where, in 1945, a small knot of men at the Humber plant on Stoke-Aldermore received an instruction that was almost an insult. Draw up an entirely new diesel engine, starting from a blank sheet of paper, for a country that could barely find the steel to build it. The man handed that instruction was Eric Coy, the chief engineer, and the team that worked beneath him never grew larger than 7 people. One of them was a young designer named Don Kitchen, who would go on to head the whole of Roots's diesel operation in later years. 2 more of them survive in the company's own records, and almost nowhere else in the world, remembered only by the names Bennett and Mialaluski. Consider what kind of country these men were laboring in. Britain in 1945 was triumphant and destitute at one and the same time. It owed the United States figures so enormous that it would still be repaying them long after the men who had signed for the loans were dead and buried. Steel was not a thing you purchased. It was a thing the government measured out to you against a license, weighed and counted. To begin an entirely new engine program in a climate like that was not an indulgence. It was a gamble, made for the simple reason that the only alternative, buying the engine ready-made from America, was unbearable to men who had just watched their own city burn for the crime of being a place that made things. It is worth pausing on what that scarcity actually meant on the shop floor. Steel came on a government allocation, weighed against a license, and a firm that went over its quota did not merely pay a higher price, it went short. Copper, aluminium, rubber, every one of them was rationed or directed or held back for export to earn the dollars the country no longer possessed. An engineer sitting down to design a new engine in 1945 was not free to choose the best material for the job. He was choosing among the materials he might realistically be granted. And the pressure to buy the finished article from across the Atlantic, rather than tool up to make it at home, was not stubbornness or pride. It was simple arithmetic. Every engine bought abroad was settled in a currency Britain had already borrowed and would be paying back for half a century. For a city like Coventry, whose entire sense of itself was bound up in the making of intricate mechanical things, to import the engine would have been to concede that the skill itself had been bombed out of existence. Coy's brief, insulting as it appeared, was in truth a quiet act of defiance. Build it here. Build it out of what little we can spare. Prove the workshop still works. The lorry the engine was meant to power had already been drawn in outline. In 1948, Commer brought out the QX, a flat-fronted cab-over-engine lorry, sharp and modern to look at, with the power unit hidden away beneath the driver to save precious length at the front. The petrol version leaned on a reworking of the Humber Super Snipe car engine, tilted over at 66 degrees so it would lie flat enough to tuck under the cab floor. It was a clever piece of packaging. What it lacked entirely was a diesel, and by the end of the 1940s, anybody with eyes in the haulage trade could see clearly enough that diesel was where the future of the long-distance lorry lay. Coy could have taken the sensible route. He could have laid an ordinary diesel down on its flank, the way the petrol unit had been laid, and called the job done. Instead, he reached for something that almost nobody in Britain had ever attempted, and that nobody anywhere had made work at this size. The opposed-piston two-stroke. 2 pistons inside every cylinder, facing one another head-to-head, driving inward toward a single shared space of combustion in the middle. No cylinder head bolted on top to crack under the heat. No poppet valves to scorch and burn away. No camshaft at all to time them. The fire happened in the narrow gap between the 2 piston crowns, and the force of it flung them apart in opposite directions in the very same instant. The opposed piston idea was not, in and of itself, Coy's own invention. The Germans had flown it in the Junkers Jumo aerodiesels. The Americans had built vast Fairbanks-Morse opposed engines for their ships and their submarines. What had barely any precedent whatsoever was the manner in which Coy intended to collect that motion together. Those earlier engines all used 2 crankshafts, one at each end of the cylinder, geared to work in concert. Coy wanted a single shaft, and nothing more. The only known ancestor for that particular piece of cunning was a Swiss Marine engine from before the war, the Sulzer ZG9, which used a bell crank arrangement to draw the motion of opposed pistons down onto one shaft. Whether the team studied it in detail or simply arrived at the same answer under their own steam, the records do not entirely settle. What is beyond any doubt is that nobody had ever built such a thing small enough, light enough, and cheap enough to sit beneath a lorry seat and earn its living on British roads. It is worth understanding why the single crankshaft was the truly difficult part, because it is the whole reason the engine is remembered at all. An opposed piston engine that uses 2 crankshafts is, in principle, already a solved problem. The Junkers Jumo diesels that powered German reconnaissance aircraft used exactly that layout, a crank at each end of the cylinder, geared together, and they flew reliably for years on end. The great Fairbanks-Morse engines that drove American submarines through the war ran on the same principle at colossal scale. 2 shafts is the sensible way to catch the motion of pistons hurling themselves apart in opposite directions, because each shaft simply takes charge of the piston nearest to it. The trouble is that 2 crankshafts mean 2 sets of main bearings, a train of gears to tie them together, and a great weight and length and expense on top. None of that would ever go beneath the cab floor. Coy's insistence on a single shaft was precisely what forced the bell cranks into being, and the bell cranks were precisely what made every man who ever saw the engine stop and stare. He was not reaching for novelty to be clever. He was solving a packaging problem the sensible answer could not solve, and the solution he reached for had, as far as anybody can establish, been tried exactly once before in a Swiss Marine engine that most British engineers had never so much as heard of. The question hanging over the whole enterprise was about as blunt as a question can be. Would the thing even run? Then came the night it did. The test cell at Stoke-Aldermore was bare concrete and hard strip lighting, the smell of cutting oil hanging thick in the cold air. When the prototype fired for the very first time, the room filled with the sharp undertaste of fresh lubricant burning off metal that had never yet been hot. That first firing offended every instinct an engine man carried in him. It was uneven at idle, stumbling, a noise the ear simply refused to file under the heading of diesel. Then, as the revolutions climbed, it drew itself together, the stumble tightening down into a fast, hard, mechanical beat. And through the side panel, you could watch the very thing that made it impossible to look away. 6 rockers, working through a bell crank geometry that bent the motion of the pistons around a corner and delivered every last bit of it onto a single crankshaft. Men who had spent their entire working lives building engines stood and watched it spin like a conjuring trick they could not quite see the trick of. So the impossible engine had run. But a machine that fires for one night on a test bed has proved almost nothing yet, and Coy knew it perfectly well. The road, the heat, the dust, the endless hard miles of a working life were all still in front of it, and any single one of them could have exposed the whole idea as nothing more than a clever dead end. Before we find out whether it survived them, if this is the kind of story you came here for, the British engineering that broke every rule and then had to earn its keep, hit subscribe. There is a great deal more of it on this channel, and I think you will want to see where it goes. Now back to Coventry. It ran. The gamble had paid off. And in the same breath, it handed Coy a second problem that would trail the engine for the rest of its days. Because the very architecture that made it brilliant also made it loud. And the particular sort of loud it happened to be would matter far more than anybody in that room could have imagined. A 2-stroke fires on every single turn of the crankshaft. To feed an appetite like that, it needs a blower forcing air through ports cut into the walls of the cylinder, in at one side, out at the other. What comes of it is a hard, barking, ceaseless roar, and it is stitched into the very way the engine draws its breath. It was brutal inside the cab. It carried for a mile across open country. That roar would be the engine's calling card for 20 years. And one day, in a boardroom on the far side of an ocean, that same roar would be handed to a room full of engineers as the pretext for killing it. First, though, Coy's men had to prove that the impossible engine was not simply one night's good fortune. They had to make it work for a living. The finished engine had no earthly right to do what it did. From 3 cylinders and 6 pistons, displacing a mere 3,261 cubic centimeters, a fraction under 200 cubic inches, barely over 3 liters, the TS3 delivered 105 brake horsepower at 2,400 revolutions a minute. But the number that truly mattered to a working haulier was the torque. 270 pound-feet of it, and it arrived low down at 1,200 revolutions a minute, exactly where a lorry actually spends its life. That was the output of British and American diesels of 6 and 7 liters. Coy's engine wrung the same pulling power out of roughly half the size, and a good deal less weight into the bargain. The mechanism that delivered it deserves slowing right down for. 3 cylinders lying flat on their sides. Inside each one, 2 pistons facing off against one another. As they rushed together, they trapped and squeezed the air caught in the middle. Fuel went in, the charge lit, and the explosion drove them back apart. The genius of it, and equally the oddity of it, lay in how that opposing motion ever found its way to the crankshaft at all. Each piston was joined by its connecting rod to a rocker, a bell crank, which swung the straight line push of the piston round through an arc and set it down onto the single crank at the base of the engine. 6 pistons, moving in 3 opposed pairs, their force bent around corners and gathered together onto one shaft. It ought never to have been possible to package. It was, and it worked, and there is a good reason the engineers who saw it never forgot the sight. There is a tale people are fond of telling about the name, that the TS in TS3 stands for Tilling-Stevens, the Maidstone firm where the engines were later built. It is the natural assumption. It is also, on the better evidence, mistaken. The reliable accounts, running back to Don Kitchen's own correspondence, are plain enough. TS stands for two-stroke, and the engine's own works numbering settles the argument. The surviving prototypes carry codes such as TS-OE65, two-stroke oil engine. Development got underway at the Humber plant in Coventry in 1945, years before Roots had so much as bought Tilling-Stevens in 1950. Production only shifted to the Tilling-Stevens works at Maidstone in Kent in 1954. And that was a matter of spare floor space, nothing to do with parentage. The name had been settled long before the building that gets the credit for it ever entered the picture. So the answer to the question that had opened the engine's whole life, would it work, turned out to be a flat and ringing yes. It worked. It pulled like something twice its size. And through the 1950s it went into Commer lorries by the thousand and into the hands of the men who drove for a living. What those men made of it is the part of the story that almost nobody ever tells. The engine announced itself long before you could catch sight of the lorry it was bolted inside. That is not a figure of speech. Out on the long, empty roads of Australia and New Zealand, where the Commer discovered a second life, dragging timber and stock and freight across distances no English lane could ever imagine, you heard the roar of a working TS3 a good while before the truck itself swung into view. But there was a second sound too, one you only caught when an export lorry stood idling in the yard or crawled up a track in low gear, one the home market machines never made. Harder, more metallic, a rhythmic clatter riding along on top of the engine's own beat. The drivers had a name for that clatter. They called it the knocker. And here is the detail almost nobody ever gets right. The thing, the very sound at the start of this was quietly pointing toward all along. The knock was not the exhaust. It had nothing whatever to do with the combustion. It came from the air compressor, the Clayton Dewandre unit that charged the lorry's brake tanks, and precisely from which compressor a given truck happened to be carrying. Home market British lorries ran the smaller SC6, fitted with a harmonic damper that smoothed out the loads it fed back into the timing gears. Export trucks bound for the far side of the world got the larger SC9 with no damper at all. As those timing gears wore down over the hard miles, the compressor's back and forth loading set them clattering, and there was the knocker, at its loudest when the engine idled or crawled, a sound laid over the top of the two-stroke roar, separate from it and sharper than it. The roar every TS3 made. The knock only the export trucks made. And it was the knock the drivers took the name from. So the name was a geographical accident. A British driver might have gone his whole career without ever once hearing it. A New Zealand driver heard almost nothing else. And this is the thing worth understanding. The knocker was never a term of mockery. It was recognition. It meant a Commer was coming up the road, and the men who drove them said the word the way you say the name of something you have learned to trust. At home, the TS3 did the unglamorous work that keeps a nation supplied. It hauled coal and steel and groceries up and down a Britain still busy rebuilding itself in the liveries of haulage firms whose names have mostly faded from memory now. The men who ran those routes through the 1950s and 60s are the very men who remember the engine today. The feel of it beneath the seat, the particular way it gathered itself up and pulled away from a dead stop, the smell of it inside a cold cab on a black winter morning. Abroad, the demands were harsher and the loyalty ran deeper still. Lorries built in Kent for the A-roads of England were shipped clear to the other side of the planet and set to work in conditions their designers had never for a moment pictured. Logging tracks through the New Zealand bush, stock routes across the Australian interior, heat and dust and corrugated dirt that shook lesser machines apart at the seams. The little opposed engine took all of it. Mechanics 1,000 miles from the nearest dealership learned its habits, kept it alive on improvisation and whatever came to hand, and came to lean on it precisely because it was simple in the places where simplicity counted. No cylinder heads to lift, no valve gear to grind. Fewer of the parts that leave a man stranded at the edge of an empty road as the light goes. What struck me, working through the Australian and New Zealand accounts, was the way one particular phrase kept coming back. Operator after operator, across different decades and different countries, reached quite independently for the very same handful of words about the TS3. Not about the truck, about the engine itself. They called it the engine that made the money. The cab rusted through, the chassis flexed, the bodywork was battered senseless on bush roads, and underneath the whole lot the little opposed-piston 3 just kept pulling, kept paying, kept earning. They did not say it of the lorry. They said it of the engine. The engine was the asset. Everything else was only the wrapping around it. That loyalty was not blind, and it is only fair to be honest about the trade the drivers were making. The TS3 was never an easy engine to live alongside. The roar came straight up through the floor into the cab, and a full day behind it left a man's ears ringing well into the evening. It drank oil in a way a 4-stroke did not, because a 2-stroke by its very nature burns off a little of its own lubricant on every cycle, and a driver learned to carry more of it and to check the level with something close to religious care. The blower and the ports and the opposed pistons all wanted setting up correctly, and an engine that had drifted out of tune let everyone within earshot know about it. What the men put up with all of that for was the one thing the engine never once failed to give them. It pulled. On a loaded climb, where a bigger and heavier diesel would strain and fall back, the little 3 found its torque low down and simply kept hauling. And when something did go wrong, there was less of it there to go wrong. No cylinder head gasket waiting to let go under the load of a long, hot climb. No burnt exhaust valve to strand a man on a mountain road at dusk. In a country the size of New Zealand, where the nearest fitter might be a full day's drive away, that simplicity was not a convenience. It was the difference between a load delivered and a load stuck fast on a hillside. The engine earned its keep because it kept going, and a driver forgives a very great deal in a machine that does not leave him stranded. An engine that earns loyalty of that kind has a character to it, and this one's reach was about to stretch a very long way indeed from a muddy logging track, because the same 3 cylinders that dragged timber through the bush and grain across the dust also went motor racing. Or rather, they carried the cars that did, and the road that ran from the outback to the starting grid at Le Mans passed, of all the unlikely places, through a chartered accountant in Edinburgh and one of the most beautiful machines Britain ever built. In November 1951, a man named David Murray founded a racing team called Écurie Écosse out of a mews at Merchiston in Edinburgh, with the engineer Wilkie Wilkinson at his side. Murray was no idle heir to a fortune. He was a chartered accountant by profession, a man of leisures who also happened to own a run of Edinburgh pubs and a wine importing business, and who poured the takings of the lot into racing dark blue Scottish cars against the finest in the world, against every reasonable expectation. And they won. Écurie Écosse took Le Mans outright in 1956, and then again in 1957, with Jaguar D-types. A privateer Scottish outfit beating the great factory teams at the hardest endurance race on Earth, 2 years running. To grasp what that actually meant, hold in mind the company they were keeping. Le Mans in the middle of the 1950s was the proving ground of Jaguar and Ferrari and Aston Martin and Mercedes. Works teams with works money standing behind them. Écurie Écosse was a private concern run out of an Edinburgh mews on the profits of a wine business and a handful of public houses. That a team like that could win the 24 hours back-to-back is one of the great underdog stories in the whole of British motorsport, and the lorry that carried their cars there deserves to sit in exactly the same memory. Cars of that value have to be moved, and in 1959, the team commissioned a transporter to do the job in style. The project was set in motion by Alistair Cormack, a roots agent who saw what the humble Commer chassis might be made into. The body itself was drawn by Selby Howgate at the Falkirk coach builders Walter Alexander. What Howgate produced was extraordinary. A sweeping 3-tier aluminium body that could carry 3 racing cars at a time and looked, seen from the side, like something out of a future that never quite arrived. It made its debut in 1960, and that same year it went to Le Mans, carrying a D-type across Europe on the roof of a lorry. Beneath that streamlined body, hauling priceless racing machinery clear across the continent, sat a Commer. And beneath the Commer's floor sat a TS3. Most British men of a certain age never once laid eyes on the real transporter. They owned it all the same. At Christmas 1961, Corgi released a diecast model of the Acuri Ecos transporter, and it became one of the most treasured toys of its whole era. A small blue lorry that sat under thousands of trees and lodged itself in thousands of memories. For a boy in 1962, that model was very likely the only Acuri Ecos transporter he would ever hold in his hands. For a great many of the men who would come to know this story, the diecast came first, and the real thing came later, if it ever came at all. The toy outlived the team. It outlived the factory. It outlived the engine. For a whole generation, it is the single most familiar object the TS3 ever powered, even though almost none of them had the faintest idea there was a TS3 inside it at all. As for the real transporter, when it finally came up for sale at Bonhams in December 2013, the hammer came down at a fraction under £1.8 million for a lorry with a 3.25-litre engine tucked under the seat. For most of the 1950s and on into the 1960s then, the TS3 was a genuine British triumph, admired by the engineers who understood it, trusted by the men who drove it, exported all around the world, and cast in diecast beneath the Christmas tree. It had answered every question its makers had ever thought to put to it. What happens to this engine next is the part I still find hard to explain, and it was decided by a man who never once came to hear it run. Before we get to him, if this is the kind of story you want more of, the British engineering that outran everyone and then got thrown away anyway, hit subscribe. There is a lot more of it on this channel, and I think you will want to see where it goes. Now, back to Coventry. There was only one threat the TS3 could not engineer its way clear of, and it had nothing at all to do with pistons or timing gears or compressors. It was sitting in an office in Detroit, reading a balance sheet. While the TS3 was carrying racing legends across France and sitting beneath Christmas trees in diecast blue, something was moving toward Coventry that not one of the men who built it had any say over. In 1964, an American corporation quietly bought itself a foothold in the company that owned them all. 30% of the voting shares of the Roots Group, 50% of the non-voting. A door had been left standing ajar, and the man who would eventually walk through it had no interest in opposed-pistons, no interest in Le Mans, and no intention of ever coming to listen. His name was Lynn Townsend, and he was an accountant. He had joined Chrysler in 1957 as controller. Out of the auditing world he had come up in. On the 27th of July 1961, he became president of the corporation, described at the time as the first bean counter ever to hold the post. And by 1967 he was chairman of it. His instrument was the spreadsheet before the spreadsheet had been invented. His strategy was consolidation across the whole globe. Standardize the platforms, standardize the engines, standardize the economics across entire continents, and cut away anything that failed to fit the pattern. To understand what came next, you have to understand how a man like Townsend saw a company like Roots. Roots was not one firm at all, but a loose gathering of famous names, Humber and Hillman and Sunbeam and Commer and Carrier, each with its own factories, its own engineering, its own settled way of doing things, assembled over decades by the Roots brothers into a group that made everything from small saloons to heavy lorries. To the men who had built it, that variety was the entire point. To an accountant running a global corporation, it was waste. Every distinct engine meant a distinct set of tools, a distinct network of parts, a distinct body of knowledge and training that could not be shared with anything else across the empire. Consolidation was not a grudge Townsend held against Coventry. It was the whole logic of the job he had been handed, applied without exception across 3 continents at once. The tragedy for the TS3 was that it was the single most distinctive thing in the entire group. There was nothing else remotely like it anywhere in Chrysler's vast holdings. No shared tooling, no common parts, no way on earth to fold it into the standard machine. The very qualities that made engineers love it, its originality, its flat refusal to resemble anything else in the world, were exactly the qualities that marked it out for deletion. A more ordinary engine might have survived simply by being unremarkable enough to leave well alone. The TS3 was killed for being singular, which is a strange and bitter thing for brilliance to be punished for. Chrysler tightened its grip in stages. The 1964 stake became operational control by 1967. In 1970, the Roots Motors name was retired altogether, and the whole concern was made over into Chrysler United Kingdom. The Coventry firm that had built an engine out of nothing in a bombed-out city was now a single line on a Detroit balance sheet. By then, Coy's team had already built the engine's successor, and it was magnificent. The TS4 took everything the TS3 had proved and made it larger and finer. 4 cylinders, 8 pistons, more power, more refinement, the rough edges machined smooth. 14 prototypes were built. 8 of them went into lorries for road evaluation. 6 stayed on the test beds. The 8 road trucks piled up 1.25 million miles between them, hard-proving miles, and the engine came through it. It worked. It was ready for production. It would have carried Commer well into the next decade on its own merits and asked for nothing. Detroit ordered it scrapped. All 14. Here is the part I find genuinely hard about this. The argument put forward at the time was noise, that the whole TS program could never meet the legislation coming down the line. So I went hunting, through everything I could lay my hands on, for the record of a formal evaluation. The test in which the TS4 was actually measured against those regulations and found wanting. I have not been able to find one. As far as the surviving record shows, the decision to kill it was taken before any such test ever existed. I want to be careful here. That is an inference drawn from an absence, not a proven fact. And yet a company does not order 14 working prototypes destroyed over a noise rule it never once measured them against, unless noise was never truly the reason. The reason is on the record, and it sits in another set of contracts entirely. Chrysler had thrown in its lot with Cummins, a joint venture in England, and a commitment to build the Cummins engines in its trucks. It leaned on Perkins for diesels besides. The instruction to scrap the prototypes, in the words of the company's own account, was given to protect that joint venture with Cummins. A successful TS4 would have gone straight up against the very engines its new owners had already promised to buy and to build. The noise argument was the case the engineers were handed to make in public. The Cummins deal was the reason underneath it. Strip the noise away and what remains is simpler and uglier. The best diesel in the building had to go because it threatened contracts Detroit had already signed, and the particular cruelty of it lies in how ordinary the whole thing was. Townsend was no pantomime villain twirling a moustache. His logic on paper held together well enough. A proprietary engine with its own tooling, its own training, its own parts network, sitting in a corner of the truck market Chrysler did not care about, is precisely the kind of anomaly a consolidator wipes away without a second thought. There is no record that he ever visited Coventry. There is no record that he ever heard a TS3 run. The engine that 7 men had built on rationed steel, that hauled timber across Australia and carried racing cars to Le Mans, was ended by a man who, as far as the paper shows, never once came to look at it. It was killed by indifference, which is somehow the worse of the two. TS3 production limped on until 1972, seeing out the commitments already made, and then it simply stopped. Commer lorries took the Perkins diesel in its place. The Commer name itself was in time folded away and swapped out for Dodge. The most brilliant diesel Britain ever made simply ceased to exist. And the order was that every last TS4 prototype should go into the skip, which leaves us only the one question worth ending on. Did anything at all survive? Stand at Stoke-Aldermore today and there is nothing to find. The test cell is gone. The Humber plant is gone. The ground was cleared long ago and given over to the ordinary business of a car park and a trading estate. No plaque, no trace of it anywhere. So close your eyes. It is night in the test cell once more. Bare concrete, hard strip lighting, the smell of cutting oil and hot metal in the cold. The roar is there, that hard, uneven, barking rhythm the ear cannot place. And behind the side panel, 6 rockers are working through that impossible bent geometry, folding the motion of 6 pistons around a corner and down onto a single crank. And gathered around the engine, 7 men, slide rules in their hands, rationed steel on the bench, a blank sheet of paper in a broken city, and the sheer nerve to build the impossible thing drawn upon it. Open your eyes. Cleared ground. And yet, not quite nothing. Detroit ordered all 14 TS4s destroyed, and very nearly all of them were. But 4 slipped the net. 3 of them survive in British museums to this day, 1 in the Leyland collection among them. The 4th travelled furthest of all. Engine OE65 was a test-bed prototype that should have gone into the skip with the rest. Instead, it was tracked down decades later, shipped out to New Zealand, and rebuilt by a man named Mark Erskine in Otahuhu in Auckland. It is the only one of the 14 left in private hands, and the only one anywhere on Earth that still runs. And in San Diego, a company called Achates Power, founded in 2004, is building opposed-piston diesels for the lorries of the future, and calling that layout the most efficient diesel architecture there is. They use 2 crankshafts, the conventional way, not Coy's single-shaft bell crank trick. But it is the architecture his team proved out 3/4 of a century early, in a bombed city, on borrowed money, with almost no precedent and no permission at all. So the next time somebody tells you that Britain could not build things, that the cleverness had drained out of it, play them that knock. We threw away the finest diesel engine we ever made, and somewhere in New Zealand, tracked down and brought home and coaxed back into life, one of them is running still, waiting for us to remember what we once were. If you ever drove a Commer and felt that 2-stroke roar come up through the cab floor, if you knew the knocker from a bush track in New Zealand or a paddock in the Australian outback, or you have stood beside one of the last ones still turning over and understood exactly what was thrown away, tell us below. Every comment gets read. And if you want more of these stories, the ones we tell here and the ones you share, hit subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.